Well, one of the issues I think is that there's obviously a great deal of different ages, different ranges that you can design for and target with these products. Can you talk about the issues involved with doing products for toddlers or for pre-K or grade school kids or older kids? What are the kind of issues that come up at different ages?
Well, the American Academy of Pediatrics still says no media for children under 2, but we know that most parents don't follow that at all, and that's not based on good research or anything like that. I'll tell you something fascinating, though. We did a study, Dubbit did a study along with the BBC and the University of Sheffield last year of kids 0 to 5 and use of a tablet. And we found that there's this really interesting developmental process or developmental progression where you can almost track the age and stage of the child by what they're able to do with a tablet. So swiping comes first. It's the first thing they learn quite early, down as young as a year sometimes. And then from there to age 5, you can really understand how their brains are developing by what functions they're able to do. Obviously, there's things that you just don't want to do, that you can't do with children under a certain age. You really want to respect the play patterns that are natural to them. Play doesn't change over time, context changes. You don't want things that are going to upset parents like advertising within the game or anything like that.
What do you see as issues for different ages?
Yeah, so actually we're primarily focused on games for probably the youngest that would play any of our games is 8 years old, I would say. So we haven't dealt with any complications with really, really young kids. But I think just maybe to speak a little bit about some of the different games. So one of the games, Stagecraft, is a foreign language learning game. And I think what was important to us that we realized in the design process is by coming up with a game mechanic that really speaks to how we actually learn language by tying what we hear and what we read to visual representations of the world. By doing that, we actually opened it up to kids as well as older learners. So we hit a wider range by really tying into the actual learning patterns that exist in foreign language learning. And then another example, we have a game that's about making sentences. It's about making whimsical and absurd sentences. And so in a sense, you're learning about sentence structure, but we make it very just part of an experience of playing with the words, playing with the language. And we actually have a lot of adults that play the game, as well as teens. So it's both. And we get great feedback that parents like playing it with their children. It's a way to spend time together making silly sentences and learning about grammar together. So.
Yeah, so I've done a lot of children's apps that were aimed at two primary age groups, about 4 to 8 and 8 to 12, tweens. And one of the things that we've really learned is a couple of things. Multi-touch experiences tend to get overused because of the technology. It's whizzy, it's fun to pinch and spread. But when you're dealing with a young child who might need a parent to actually hold the tablet for them, you have to really kind of bring a simpler user experience to mind. So one of the things that we did is we really try to avoid too many complications in the gestural experience. We really limiting it to a tap and a swipe as much as possible. We try to avoid double tap or pinch spread gestures because those are complicated for young children to learn and to target. And speaking of targeting, another thing that you want to consider very carefully is the size of what is a button. So, a parent, an older person will have an easier time using a forefinger to target a fairly small space on the screen. But when you're developing a mobile app, especially if it's going to be aimed at a phone user, you've really got to reconsider the way you scale your user interaction elements so that there's enough real estate for the child to not as refined, with the hand motor coordination, reach in and touch that button. So, 3/4 inch buttons or even bigger. And a lot of times you may not want to visually, present that much real estate for a button. So there's ways around that by creating a hit space that's invisible to the user that's around the button. So that you create an effective target area that's bigger, even if they're not quite on the button exactly, they're close enough. and allows them to have that level of interaction. You need to avoid too many refined sort of drag and drop experiences. So, for example, we had an art element, almost like a mini Photoshop component that we built in one of our children's apps, and we realized that making the user tap to drag a stamp into the canvas area was overly complicated. We just let them tap the stamp, and then the stamp placed itself in the middle, and then they can tap and drag it. That became an easier experience, an easier flow for the child. So don't over sophisticate, your user experience when you're aiming at young children. Tap and swipe is really all you need most of the time. The last thing I would mention is the iconography. Remember that these children may not be able to read yet, and so be careful about using words as your user interface elements. It's important to offer perhaps words and pictures, and picking an iconography that's something that will be symbolic and represent something a young child will understand. They're not going to understand a floppy disk image as a save icon, so you have to think differently about what does that look like when you want to give them the option to save.
And even up to older ages, because we know that Gen Z communicates in emoji now, so
Right.
using a good iconography. I was just going to add, listening to them discuss the design process, the marketing of what you do for kids is really important as well. Where we as an industry have gotten ourselves in trouble in the past is by trying to promise outcomes to parents, to say this will help your kid read sooner, read better, learn faster, be smarter, and that's where we get attacked by consumer groups who say, prove it. So if you can't prove those things, and they're very hard to prove, talk about what goes into your game, talk about what goes into your app, talk about your philosophy of how kids will learn from it, because teaching is something you control. How you teach through an app, through a game, is something you control. How kids learn is a very complicated process that depends a lot on the environment, on a lot of things that are out of your control.